Hi, my name's Sophie Woodward. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of Manchester.
I'm Kath Woodward, and I'm an emeritus professor of sociology at the Open University.
So, this book, Multidisciplinary Approaches to Gender Studies, importantly, is multidisciplinary. And I think we find considerations of sex and gender across the whole spectrum of medical, social sciences, humanities, although very differently conceived. And I think in lots of ways this is because gender itself is so complicated. Gender is lived through our bodies, it is enacted on and inflected and influenced differently by medicine. It's produced through words, media discourses, and regulations, intersects with class and other inequalities. And to get to this, we argue you need all disciplines on board. But then that raises the problem, how do we work together? There's a presumption that this is interdisciplinarity, but we agree, certainly sometimes that's the case. But in this book, we make a case for why multidisciplinarity. So disciplines have their own histories, methods, what counts as knowledge. And what we do here is we think about how disciplines have their own history of being gendered, but also how do they see gender in different ways. So what we look at is how disciplines are gendered and the concepts and methods and what counts as knowledge of gender in different disciplines. And we argue that this is what allows us to think about how can we collaborate and what kind of challenges collaboration poses, but also what's particular about gender. So the approach that we take to multidisciplinarity, because it's a challenge to do this, is something called facet methodology, which was developed by Jennifer Mason. And usually this approach has been taken towards design and methods, but we've adapted it as an approach for us to think about the relations between different disciplines. So what we do is we take one facet or area and use different disciplines to think about how do they look at this. And in putting them in relation, this gives us flashes of insights around different facets of gender. And I think we argue that this really helps us to think about gender in a very entangled kind of way. And we draw in particular about the idea from Strathern that gender is a relation. So we put methods in a relation to help us to understand that. So in the book, we make each chapter a facet and we put these different disciplinary approaches, often in very unexpected ways. And the idea is then we can really shine lights on different considerations of gender in new ways. So it takes different forms and we don't put every discipline in every chapter, but we put a few key ones together. And so we've organised the book around a series of different facets. These include gender and everyday, power and politics, histories, herstories, bodies, flesh and embodiment, and rules, law and regulation. And these are the facets we've ordered the book around.
Gender has a history, and gender studies have always been seen as interdisciplinary. But we would like to use multidisciplinarity to retain the integrity of individual disciplines and to show how gender plays out differently in different disciplines. Gender is complicated, but we also need to look at the history of gender and the way in which gender has been construed in binary terms. I don't think we want to start at year zero. I think we have to look at the history and see where it's come from, look at the genealogy of gender. So we look at gender as a relationship which is both empirical and conceptual. And we look at gender as illustrative of the way in which power operates in different disciplines. If, for example, you look up physics and gender in a search engine, what you'll get is the underrepresentation of women, girls and women in the discipline. And it's this is very important material. You'll also get activism and the way in which gender is the motor for activism at promoting further inclusion. And we do need this kind of evidence. We need the evidence of numbers. However, if you look it up, gender and sociology, you might be more likely to get gender as an explanatory framework for looking at social divisions, socio-cultural, economic, political divisions, which are motivated by gender and the genders that different people have. So I think we do have to look at the history of binary gender, but we are not only looking, obviously, at male and female. We're looking at the ways in which gender in any particular, either everyday or social or political context, is is constructed and regulated. And one of the things we do look at is rules and regulations in relation to the kind of DEI policies that most universities have. All universities have, although they might be under threat in parts of the world. But it's difficult, it's complicated, and that's where the complications arise. But all sorts of different components are involved, which include biology. Otherwise, where would the discipline of biology be? But it is a factor. But we're looking at it in relation to how it plays out in different disciplines and using gender as a way of starting the conversation. And what we're trying to do in relation to gender is to promote a conversation between disciplines, not just a discipline using another one when it seems appropriate, but in actually asking each other questions. And one of the questions is about how different disciplines actually construct gender and what they mean by it, which is particularly useful if you're looking, for example, at social policy. But even in looking at biology, where also the social sciences and humanities offer everyday experiences, they offer personal narratives, they offer different ways of addressing experience, the experience of gender and who we think we are and how we see ourselves, which is also very constructive. The next stage in which we would like to argue for in the book, and which we hope will take up these conversations, is the way in which conversations operate using gender and using different historical contemporary modes and different terrains on which gender is negotiated. And some of the examples that we use relate, for example, to medical science and to environmental science, which are both disciplinary areas which encompass a whole range of other disciplines, but where we think conversations over multidisciplinarity could be very fruitful.
And I think these conversations will hopefully be the beginning of many more.